So quick look at the agenda. We'll talk to visitors, and we've got at least one on board with us tonight. Membership is up to 55 right now. Of course, we're always right after renewal time. We have people coming in, trickling in over the next few months. So if you haven't signed up yet for your renewal, now's the time to do it. Tom will be looking for you. We have a number of ways that you can follow us on social media. The thing that I think most people would be interested in right now is our YouTube channel, where we're putting the recordings of these meetings. Thanks to Robert, who's been doing a great job being our Zoom host. The program tonight is going to be twofold. First of all, we're going to have Nancy B presenting our list of candidates for the 2021 board. And then we're going to have the major program, which is going to be by Craig Gowens, which will be on developing DNA testing plan for your genealogical records. Okay, quick look at the board. There we are in all our glorious color. Hopefully we'll have at least one new face come next year into this group so we can have a full board. Still missing a vice president. So before I go any further, let me just mention that we have a visitor tonight from the London Mac user group. That's Craig Jobbins. And there's their link. I asked if he wanted to say hello. He said yes, but I wanted to put him early in the list in case he wants to give up the meeting and go get some sleep, since it's after 1 a.m. his time. So Craig, do you want to let me cancel the sharing? So there we go. So Craig, wherever you are.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. Yes, it is 1 a.m. in the morning, rather different time zone to yourselves. I just wanted to say hello, more importantly. I can also tell you a bit about myself and my Apple Mac journey. I have a kind of a mixed introduction to my Mac experience. I joined the Mac user group here in London, which is actually the UK's oldest Mac user group. I joined about 7 years ago now, but I came to find the Mac user group here in London after becoming the UK's first ever iPhone customer. So I spent very many number of days outside the Apple Regent Street store prior to the Apple launch, and had a fortunate meeting with Steve Jobs a month before it was actually launched, because at that point it was launched in the US, obviously, before it came to the UK. So we actually saw Steve Jobs in the November, just a month before it was actually launched.
Wow.
I think, isn't the UK Regency store one of the bigger ones?
It was the biggest Apple store for a long period of time. I believe it's now been taken over by France, if I'm not mistaken. But at the rate that they're actually opening stores now, I'm not surprised if that's changed since.
Just being from Texas, you know, it was kind of disconcerting to find out London was bigger.
The store was actually closed for almost 9 months while it was refit. That was an interesting experience. They actually moved the store into the basement level. So for almost 9 months, visitors were visiting what they thought was the storeroom of the store under the ground. That was quite an interesting experience for a while. Prior to the iPhone launch, I probably queued outside Apple stores for the next 5 products after that. I went and traveled around some different stores. I've actually managed to see many of the Apple UK stores open, fortunately enough. Covent Garden was the most exciting experience. Obviously, they've now changed how the setup is done with a product launch. It's all pre-order online.
Craig, I visited the Regency store, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe because that building was repurposed for Apple, there is actually an entrance that only the Queen can use in the middle. There's like a center door that was only her entrance, and I believe that's probably the only store in the world that has that.
Yes, there is an arched glass doorway in the center. It was formerly a government building at one point before it then became a tea merchant was one particular use of that building. I actually remember the building sitting empty for a number of years. The actual Regent Street is the main shopping centre in central London. And at the moment, it's seeing massive changes. COVID-19 has not helped at all. Lots of the big retailers are reconsidering their positions in that street.
We're seeing the same thing here.
One interesting random fact was that there was a big announcement this time last year when Microsoft opened their largest Microsoft store just a few doors away from the Apple store, which is now permanently closed. Microsoft have actually closed all of their stores. So it's quite interesting to see a rather sad and tired looking store a few doors down. Something we've done differently because of the virus situation is normally we would meet in a pub in central London. We have over 100, 110 members signed up on our books. To be honest, active, it's probably about 30 at any one time. Restrictions have changed how we obviously operate. So again, we jumped onto the Zoom bandwagon along with everyone else. And that was part of our push towards building a podcast. We've been wanting to do that for quite a while now, and we wanted to find a new format of doing that. The suggestion was made by 2 or 3 other members that are actually featured in the podcast. I don't know if anyone's actually heard it, but what we was trying to achieve was to try and bring all different types of Mac user groups together. I don't think that's been achieved before. I don't know if it's a similar basis in the US, but we've actually seen a decline in Mac user groups in the UK. There's been a lot that have folded purely based on member numbers or people not wanting to volunteer their time. The format has changed quite a lot. And one of the reasons we think behind that is that Apple has become so much more accessible to people in regards to online training. YouTube had a massive impact to that. Again, social media. We've explored different channels in that regard, and I'd be interested to find out if you've done anything different or you've seen some similarities to us in that regard.
Well, from what I've heard here, many of the Mac user groups are having difficulties maintaining their membership. We've been pretty fortunate that our membership has stayed quite strong, and we consistently have 30, 35 members at our meetings. So that's good. I'll follow up with you offline more as you and I discuss things.
Good to have you
any
here.
other questions for Craig?
Well, I was just going to add, I volunteer with some folks that are real PC kind of people, and they're directly involved with, I guess, what amounts to the PC users group here in Austin, and they're seeing the same thing. I mean, it's really fallen off because, in a manner of speaking, PCs have become kind of commodities, and unless you're a gamer or something and have a vital interest in fiddling around with hardware, most people just, load, I don't know, whatever, Windows 10 and Microsoft Office and a couple other things, and off they go, and they, and so as a result, there just seems there's a drop off in this kind of thing overall. I think also there's a big move of people for people to move to either tablets or phones, and they center their lives around those things. Many people informally, I think if you're in business, maybe a laptop or a desktop's more appropriate, but a lot of folks get by with, say, an iPad, for example.
Yeah,
I second Peter's comments. I see the same thing, that in general, more and more people are buying computers or computer type devices ranging from portable phones to pads to desktops to laptops to whatever you want to find. But they become so much easier to use, and the percentage of us who like to dip into the inner workings and find out why is a smaller and smaller proportion of people.
It's a lot harder to go buy a used motherboard and assemble your own Linux server and customize it the way I used to be able to. Now everything's soldered on, very few options.
I
Other
have one quick
comment.
I have a quick question, John. If I ever get to go to my trip to London that I was supposed to get to do this year, I would like to visit their user group. If you'll, after the meeting, if you'll find out when and where they meet, I'm keeping a positive outlook on this whole thing.
Yay.
Well, actually,
By all means, I don't know if you've had this before in any of the groups or meetings that you've had, but we've actually had numbers of different visitors from different countries. We had some recently, just before the lockdown, we had some members from Italy. So we had some Italian Mac users. That was an interesting conversation. We've had a number of surprise special guests. We had one of the original architects between the Mac Mighty Mouse that was part of the design team. He lives in the UK in Wiltshire, and sometimes he will randomly appear at some of our meetings and tell us something about the time that he spent in California and the design team that he worked with.
Well, we used to meet in a
Interesting.
pub also, so it's definitely a good place to meet. Unfortunately, our pub went under. They had, which is a very sad thing, but they had a lot of, they had several locations in Houston, and flooding kind of put a strain on their balance sheet, I think.
Yeah. Due to hurricanes, which aren't very common in England, I don't think. Yeah, I
I was
can't
thinking-
Earthquakes seem to be more common at the moment. We've had a few recently.
If everyone would smile, I'll take a screenshot of everybody. Just I give you a chance to smile. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I'm done.
You got all 28 people?
Well, a lot of them didn't have their faces up, but their names are there.
Very good. Thank you for doing that. Well, then, if there's no other questions or comments for Craig, I want to go ahead and proceed with the meeting. Hearing none, I'm going to switch back to my screen share.
Brilliant, thank you.
Craig, while he's
Okay.
doing that, you might
Am I
consider
sharing?
using the chat feature and post that information about your group.
Yeah, certainly.
Are you seeing my slide deck?
No.
No.
Not yet.
Oh, sorry. Didn't hit the share button.
There it is.
There it is.
There we go. Seems like every time I do this, I have to relearn. So let's move on. Let me just talk for a moment. As you all recall, we're here last time in September. We had a program about 5G. There was a lot of discussion going on. Our last several meetings, I think starting in May, have been recorded, and we have them on our YouTube channel. The URL is here, as well as in the list of social media sites I had at the beginning of the presentation. We're looking ahead for the next few months. Nancy has organized a very nice program, which I'll talk a little bit more on later, about iOS 14 features that is going to be contributed by our membership. So she has a nice list of topics to be covered. In December, we'll have our annual holiday program done by Bob Levitas. Right now, we're looking at some kind of home kit or home automation program for January. We are, of course, always looking for our members to participate. So if you would like to do some sort of a tip, whether it be security on how to do something better, like Umberto did last week, which I'll talk back come back to in a moment, or last month, rather. You have a product review you'd like to share, we would love to have you participate in the meetings. Just let us know what it is you want to cover and what meeting you're going to be talking at. This gives you your last chance in November to help build points towards the 300 Club. Help desk continues to operate even though we're not face-to-face. So questions can be submitted through our Slack channel or send an email directly to me, and I'll send it out to the team and they'll send answers back, or I'll copy and send them back. We have had some ongoing discussions there. As Craig mentioned before, they have a podcast. I put this in here before I found out he was going to join the meeting tonight. So if you're interested in listening to their Brew and Bite show, the URL is included in the slide deck and it can be found on iTunes. I think you have 3 episodes so far.
Yes,
right, Craig?
And we are planning to record another one on Sunday in regards to the recent event.
Great. Well, I've got to add you to my list and figure out how I can get to the 1,700 other podcasts I have. I join more than I listen to, unfortunately. Now, as you probably know, there was an Apple event today. And so I found this video by Apple that's today's event in 51 seconds. And believe me, it is 51 seconds. So don't blink for the next minute. Well, I don't know how many of you got to see the total show today, but this was a very good overview, I thought, for those who hadn't seen it yet. I'm tied up myself today and expect to view it tomorrow.
Was there sound attached to that 51 seconds?
Oh, you couldn't hear it.
No, but I bet we could go to that link and watch it.
Yes.
It was quite a good presentation. If anyone has the time.
Yes, it was. It was really good.
It's only in this quick thing, it's nothing but music. So you're not hearing any discussion.
One of the
I thought
niftiest
it was a good visual presentation.
one of the niftiest things about the HomePods is that if you had a pair of them, you could set them down close to each other, and they would figure out, and they would go stereo.
Hmm.
It was oh really, typical Apple deal.
All right. Well, I wanted
Existing
to
HomePods, you
insert
can do
that
but you have
since
to
I
set it
found it.
up.
Say again, Jim?
The original HomePods can also do stereo. You just have to go into a setting in the Home app.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, lots of new stuff for us to buy and experiment with. Fodder for product reviews by our membership. Okay, so that brings us up to the primary program. But before I get there, Nancy, do you want to take a few minutes to talk about our slate of officers? I will take off my screen.
I will do that. And I also need to apologize. My camera was working just fine on Sunday. I plugged it in and unplugged it, plugged it in, and it's still not working. So forgive me. John asked that 3 of us form a committee this year to come up with a slate of officers for the 2021 board. And this is what the committee came up with and the board approved. For president, John Purvis. For vice president, Nancy Gravely. For treasurer, Tom Weaver. For secretary, Bill O'Barr. And the 3 directors, Koki Craig, Robert Fraser, and Jim Wynn. Now, everybody's going to be asked to vote by mail this year, and we'll be sending that out. But that's the slate that the committee came up with and that the board approved.
All right. Any follow-up from the group here?
Craig's clapping.
All right. Well, let me finish my introduction of Craig as the main speaker tonight and turn the screen over to him. Okay, so let me just say, Craig has been, for anyone who hasn't been aware of it, Craig's been a longtime member of CapMac. He was a part of our board for a while. Unfortunately, he had to leave us to go to the Northwest US, where he says it's quite chilly there today, as we sit here and bake in Central Texas. He has been and used various DNA tools to help investigate his family's history, and has done some other presentations on that topic. And that is what he's going to be speaking on tonight. His topic is named Developing a DNA Testing Plan and how to use that to solve mysteries about your family's heritage. So without me talking any further, let me stop my sharing. And Craig, turn it over to you.
All right. So this was actually a presentation I did last month for the National Nordic Museum. And I've made a couple of modifications to it for CapMac so that it's more tailored. It's not tailored towards Scandinavian genealogy. It's more generalized now. So I will be available in the chat room while I play the video. And then of course, if we have any other questions after the video, I'm available to talk about that. And if anybody needs me to stop the video, please let me know so we can stop it and do whatever discussion we need during the video. So let me get this started. My screen just went black. Though we tend not to think of genealogy as a science, it is an ology, meaning the science or study of. That now? Good science begins with a question, yes, and progressing through a systemic, reproducible methodology of research and experimentation to arrive at a sound conclusion. Prior to the advent of direct-to-consumer DNA testing for genealogical purposes, genealogy researchers would conduct research, evaluate the evidence, and assert a theory to try to draw a conclusion solely from the paper trail records they found. The introduction of DNA, however, gave us the ability to do something more scientific, set up an experiment and analyze the results to more accurately come to a sound conclusion. You're probably thinking, I've heard of some process like this before. Think back, maybe way back, perhaps as far back as middle school science. I'm talking about the scientific method. Tackling specific questions about genealogy using the scientific method lets you be more systematic and efficient in using DNA to solve genealogical mysteries. We start with a research question, a mystery you are trying to solve, and conduct initial research using the records we may have available. We try to form a hypothesis before setting up an experiment. The DNA testing of relevant and potentially relevant persons to establish whether a genetic connection exists. We then analyze whether those connections adequately explain the degree of the genetic connections we find, and resolve any conflicts or anomalies we find before coming to a conclusion. If we are successful in reaching a sound conclusion, we exit the loop. Otherwise, we continue iterating through the steps until successful. Start by organizing yourself into one research question at a time. A mystery you want to solve, a brick wall you want to break through. Be specific. Generally, you want to concentrate on one person or couple at a time. Overly broad questions, such as who are all 128 of my 5 great-grandparents, aren't helpful. You want to narrow it down more tightly, such as who were the parents of my great-great-grandmother, Sarah Johansson, who was born in 1858 near Duluth, Minnesota. Try to ground your question at a point or short period of time, inclusive of a person or persons, a time frame, and a locality. Gather your initial research. Using genetic genealogy doesn't mean abandoning traditional paper trail research. Try to find all the known relevant facts about your target person, the place or places they may have lived, the timing of relevant events in their life, such as births, marriages, migrations, and deaths. Use resources to discover relevant records that may be useful. The Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, and Cindy's List catalogs are invaluable resources for online sources, but don't forget about libraries and other physical repositories. Believe it or not all records of humanity are available online, at least not yet. Become familiar with the geography, old maps, natural features and barriers, the public land system entries, town, township, and county creation history, etc. Importantly, do descendancy research on the target ancestor, as cousins may have more information already. It can also be helpful to build a timeline of events, including the places. This initial research may provide you with a hypothesis before you even reach the stage of DNA testing. If it does, you have 2 pools of people to perform testing on. Your control group, people in your family whose DNA would best represent the target ancestor you are researching, and your experimental group, the people descended from your research target's theorized ancestors, but not from the target, preferably persons from both sides, the paternal and maternal. If you can't yet formulate a hypothesis, you can still proceed with DNA testing your control group, baiting the DNA testing pools, hoping you can pull in DNA matches who can serve as your experimental group. I referred to your control group as people in your family whose DNA would best represent the person you are researching. If you are an adoptee and your research question boils down to, who are my parents, then you may well be the best person to DNA test. But if your research target is further back in time, you may need to test others in your family to isolate and maximize the target's DNA. As a general rule of thumb, testing the older generations is best and yields better results because they have more of the relevant DNA, which approximately halves every generation. In other words, test up and then across your family tree. Getting a good representation of your target's DNA may mean testing multiple family members. DNA matches shared or in common with you and a cousin will usually relate on the same line, and this is the first step in isolating matches relevant to your DNA experiment. If you are looking for your great-grandfather's father, whose DNA helps most? You only got about a 6.25% of your DNA from the unknown great-great-grandfather. Is your grandfather or mother still living and able to be tested? Do you have a living aunt or uncle in this line who could be tested? What about your grandfather's siblings? Do your grandfather's siblings have any living children? All of these people have more DNA from your target than you do, and therefore would be more helpful than your own DNA. Also ask yourself, is there a direct paternal or maternal line, where Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA could also be helpful? If none of these people are available for testing, test collaterally. Test yourself and cousins. Because the target is a great-grandparent, second or third cousins are better in this case than first cousins. You may be saying, but I don't even know who my second and third cousins are, much less know them. I did say do descendancy research on your target. I wasn't kidding. In addition to potentially having more information on the research target than you, for example, the old family Bible, photos, letters, and other important documents, they also have the target's DNA. Developing a rapport and piquing research interest in distant cousins is crucial. Furthermore, you generally want to build that rapport before asking them to spit or swab. For example, here is how my real-world testing plan played out in trying to identify the parents of my 4 great-grandparents in my direct male line, Job and Catherine, a brick wall my grandfather and father had been stuck at since they started researching the family's genealogy in the 1980s. I started off by testing myself, but also more importantly tested my father, testing not just his autosomal DNA, but his Y DNA as well. This was done at Family Tree DNA. At that time, he had 2 Y DNA matches, neither of whom recognized how we might connect to them, and there weren't any obvious autosomal matches to isolate people who may be related through either Job or Catherine. I next turned to my late grandfather's sole surviving brother, and had him tested at AncestryDNA, so we would have a presence in more than one company's database. Not long after his results came back, I, as the manager of his results, was contacted by a 5th cousin. He was the manager of his grandmother's DNA test at Ancestry, and she was also a match to my great-uncle, his 3rd cousin. This distant cousin was also working on Job and Catherine's parents, and coming up empty. He had also tested his grandmother and her brother at 23andMe. We transferred the results to Family Tree DNA and to GEDmatch, so we could utilize other tools available on those sites that are not available on Ancestry. But it was becoming apparent that we needed more DNA. So I asked 2 of my grandfather's surviving first cousins on that line if they would test. One, who was already a family history researcher herself, helped me convince the other reluctant cousin. They were tested at different companies to make sure we were covering the databases adequately. The 5th cousin and I also used our descendancy research to start contacting cousins from other children of Job and Catherine, and we secured testing for another 3rd cousin of my great-uncle and his grandmother, and discovered that the youngest daughter of the youngest daughter of one of Job and Catherine's younger sons was still living at over 90 years of age. To our surprise and delight, she was excited to be tested. As we waited for those 4 DNA test results to come back, we found a match in common with my great-uncle, my father, and my cousin's grandmother and the grandmother's brother. This match had a great-grandmother whose death certificate identified her mother as Matilda Gowan, which is 1 E off from Gowan, a frequent spelling of my last name before the trailing S became standard. But Job and Catherine didn't have a known daughter named Matilda. But Matilda's details matched Job and Catherine's daughter Rhoda. We knew we were on the right track when the match excitedly emailed back that Matilda had a granddaughter that was named Rhoda. We now had a network of 9 DNA testers, excluding me and the 5th cousin, whose results are superseded by testers above us. These 9 testers proved adequate in finally solving the identity of Catherine's parents and grandparents, and the identity of Job's grandparents, though we still don't know which of the 7 sons of his paternal grandparents and which of the 3 daughters of his maternal grandparents were actually Job's parents. Subsequent DNA testing by more than 200 other descendants of Job and Catherine has only solidified the conclusions drawn from this initial pool of just 9 DNA testers. So developing a pool of DNA testers is important. If you are starting closer than your 4 great-grandparents, an excellent starter pool of testers can be your siblings. You may wonder, why would you want to test your sibling if you can simply test yourself, given you both have the same parents? While siblings each got 50% of their DNA from each parent, unless they are identical twins, it's never the same 50%. You will get DNA from your mother and father that your sibling didn't get, and they will get DNA that you didn't get. But there will also be, of course, large sections in common to you both. This is because the process by which the parent's DNA is passed down creates a random 50% of the parent's DNA. As the DNA is passed down to subsequent generations, the randomness continues. You got DNA from your grandparents that your first cousins didn't, just as they have DNA from your grandparents that you don't have. Think of a deck of playing cards, separating the reds and the blacks. Deal out half the reds and half the blacks. This set represents you, the blacks from your father, the reds from your mother. gather the cards up, shuffle, and repeat. This set represents your sibling, with some of the cards in common to both of you, but others not. One of the panicked reactions I sometimes see when siblings compare results is dismay that their ethnicity estimates are different. First off, let me point out it is an ethnicity estimate, with emphasis on estimate. Due to the random process just mentioned, two siblings will get slightly different combinations of DNA from their parents and ultimately grandparents. The randomness of the process may weight one sibling's estimate towards one grandparent over the other on that side. This happened to me. I got 50% of my DNA from each parent, since we get 23 chromosomes from each, giving us 23 matching pairs of chromosomes. But the DNA has no memory, and can't guarantee that the 50% I received from my mother is 25% from her father and 25% from her mother. Indeed, from extensive testing on both my paternal and maternal sides of the family, I know that it's about 28% of my DNA that came from my maternal grandmother, and 22% from my maternal grandfather. Note, they still add to 50%. This recombination was reasonably close to even, being only 3% off in each direction from the average of 25%. However, on my paternal side, the split was more lopsided. I'm 31% my paternal grandmother, and only 19% my paternal grandfather. Because of this uneven split, I'm not a very good proxy for that grandfather's DNA. But there is no way of knowing this sort of breakdown before testing is ever even done. This is why you may need to test multiple descendants on different lines to get a good representation of your research target ancestor. Creating a pool of descendants of your research target ancestor is the most effective way of balancing out instances of uneven inheritance of DNA and achieving greater coverage of that ancestor's DNA. The larger the pool of DNA-tested descendants, the more likely you are to find solid, relevant matches to your research question. What do I mean by coverage? Obviously, one person has 50% of the DNA of each parent, but two siblings together will capture, on average, about 75% of their parents' DNA. 3 bumps that up to about 87.5%, and with 4, you'll likely have over 90% of the parent's DNA represented in your pool of DNA testers. Dropping down one generation, one person on average gets about 25% of their DNA from each grandparent. But 2 first cousins from different parents will break 40%, with 3 approaching 60%, and 4 encompassing about 2/3 of their common great-grandparents' DNA. Second cousins are an important milestone. Second cousins are the most distant genetic relationship where you are guaranteed to share DNA. If you don't share DNA with a second cousin, chances are they are only a half-second cousin, or unrelated altogether. Creating a pool of 3 second cousins guarantees each person matches the other 2, but will also represent about 1/3 of the DNA of the great-grandparent couple they have in common. It also gives you 3 sets of shared match comparisons between the cousins, a powerful tool when you start clustering your matches. And it should be obvious, the more cousins you add from separate lines from the common ancestors, the more pairwise comparisons you get. When looking for potential descendants of your target ancestor to test, start with the descendants of the younger children of the younger children of your ancestor and work your way up from youngest to oldest. Why? By starting with the younger children of the younger children, you are more likely to find potential testers who are higher up the tree and still living. For example, my grandfather was the eldest child of the eldest of 10 children. The younger child of the 10th child was born after 5 of my aunts and uncles and is still living today, even though my grandfather died in 1992. As my grandfather's first cousin, she has about twice the amount of DNA from that line as my mother or her siblings. So how likely are you to match a particular level of cousins? As was just stated, second cousins should always share enough DNA to be matches to each other, so obviously the same holds true for first cousins. For third cousins, it varies slightly based upon which testing company you ask, but suffice it to say, around 90% or more of third cousins should match each other. Fourth cousins sees a big drop-off, with anywhere from 46 to 71% matching. Fifth cousins becomes even rarer, and sixth cousins, the chances are very low. So if you are building a pool of descendants to test, who are fourth or fifth cousins to each other, you will need more of them to ensure you have enough that match each other so you can perform comparisons. If you and a known cousin don't match, and you would like to try testing another relative of yours to confirm the relationship, who should you choose, and how likely is that person to match this cousin? Ancestry came up with this chart to help answer that question. For example, if you have a fourth cousin, you have a 71% chance of matching their DNA, according to the previous table. If the two of you wind up in that 29% who don't match, you can see which relations of yours would be best to try next. Make note that an aunt or uncle is always higher than a parent. Why? We already know that you don't match, and that could be because your parent got less of the relevant DNA in an uneven inheritance event. Thus, an aunt or uncle will have slightly better chances. All of the testing companies provide you with a list of DNA matches and estimate how close you are likely to be related to each. You will also see the amount of DNA you share with the match expressed in a unit called centimorgans. Ancestry will also provide you a pop-up showing a breakdown of how often a relationship to a match will fall into certain categories. However, there is another more popular tool for this. The Shared Centimorgan project is an invaluable resource for visualizing how a particular match may be related. The project gives the average amount of shared DNA for dozens of relationships, along with the range possible for that relationship. The website DNA Painter hosts a special tool for the Shared Centimorgan project that allows you to simply enter amount of DNA shared in centimorgans or by percentage given by 23andMe, and will gray out the relationships that are not possible for that amount of shared DNA. Like AncestryDNA, DNA Painter will show a table showing how frequently the amount of shared DNA falls into a particular relationship category. Clicking on an individual square pulls up a histogram for that relationship, showing the frequency and range of values reported to the project for that relationship. After playing around with the tool some, for some values of shared DNA, you may be exclaiming, "There are so many possibilities. Is there a better way to refine the estimate of how you relate to a specific match?" This is where having a pool of DNA testers starts revealing its magic. When you look at a match from just the perspective of your results, it can be difficult to pin down how they may be related. However, if you know the amount of DNA particular matches share with multiple people, you can start refining the estimate to not just a smaller set of relations, but also maybe a particular line of your family tree that the person is likely related on. To do this, stay at DNA Painter and go to the What Are the Odds or WADO tool. WADO lets you build a descendancy tree of known DNA-tested descendants and add branches to the tree as hypotheses, giving you relative probabilities of which hypotheses are most likely to be true. Once again, you need your descendancy research of your target ancestor. A few years ago, I had a DNA match who was adopted and looking for her birth parents. Solving how she connects to me would go a long way towards solving the other side of her family, since matches on my side could then be excluded, with the remaining matches being from the unknown side of her parentage. Using the WADO tool's tree-building functionality, I built a basic descendancy tree of DNA testers on the line I believed her to be on. She then gave me access to her results, so I could fill in the known matches' centimorgan values. I then populated the tree with hypotheses, including half relationships, to see if there were any significantly more likely than the others. The way to read the results is that impossible relationships have a score of 0 and are shown in red. The lowest possible relationship always has a score of 1, and all other possible relationships are scored relative to the lowest. Hypothesis 10 is over 600,000 times more likely than the lowest and is 36 times more likely than the next highest possible relationship. 3 of Rosalie Baker's 7 children had DNA-tested descendants. Their shared DNA amounts, along with those of other cousins, produced a strong hypothesis. The most likely scenario was that the adoptee is a grandchild of one of the 4 children who didn't have any known DNA-tested descendants. When those children were investigated, only one lived in the area where the adoptee had been born, and she only had 2 children, a male and a female. Similar work was then done on the opposite side of her parentage, yielding only one candidate parent who fit the description of the non-identifying information the tester had received from her adoption agency. The sole candidate had to be the mother, so the grandchild of Rose, who was the adoptee's parent, had to be the male, the grandson. Less than a month after I had pieced all of this together for the adoptee, she had a new DNA match pop up in her list of matches. It was her aunt. It had confirmed that our research was in fact correct. That said, WADO isn't foolproof. Often the relative probability is not as overwhelming as it is in this case, and may yield several plausible hypotheses, but it can help filter out the lesser possibilities so you can focus on the most likely scenarios first. WADO is also ineffective if you are related to a match in more than one way. In cases of pedigree collapse and endogamy, WADO is not that effective. When you scroll down from the tree portion of the WADO tool page, you will also get a table ranking the hypotheses and giving you a pecking order to follow as to the most likely scenarios. You will also see the relative probability of each hypothesis compared to the next highest hypothesis. Another question to ask is where you should do your DNA testing to maximize the possibilities of getting useful matches. Right now there are 4 major testing companies who have a sizable, robust database size, and a 5th who is just starting out building a database of users, but still might be useful in limited circumstances. AncestryDNA is by far the largest database. If you can only initially afford to test at one company, this may be your best choice. Ancestry's database is heavily skewed to American testers. If you are of more recent European heritage and are looking to get matches on the other side of the Atlantic, MyHeritage has a better penetration in the European market, and you may get more relevant matches on those lines from MyHeritage. However, Family Tree DNA enjoys popularity in Scandinavia, and is also the only choice if you want Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA testing. But let's not forget about 23andMe, which has the 2nd largest database. Bringing up the rear is Living DNA, which has a very small database, but their focus is on more geographically specific ethnicity estimates, especially in the British Isles. If you know your ancestors came from a specific country of origin, but don't know where in the country they came from, taking the Living DNA test or transferring your results there may point to subnational regions where your ancestors may have migrated from. This can be crucial in finding repositories that will have records of your ancestors. We are all looking to save money and be more efficient with our spending, so what is the best bang for the buck solution? For starters, you need to know that some companies require you to take the DNA test with them in order to get results, but others allow you to transfer results from another testing company into their database. You can leverage this to stretch your money further so that you can save money or use it to test even more relatives. This path starts with testing at AncestryDNA, the company with the largest database. Their test is normally only $99, but can sometimes be acquired on sale for as little as $49. The sales tend to be around winter holiday season, Mother's and Father's Day, and during the summer. From Ancestry, you can download your raw DNA results and use the autosomal transfer option at Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage, which both charge a small fee to unlock it. And if you so choose, you can also upload to the third-party matching site GEDmatch. If you want to expand further, you can buy the Ancestry-only version of the 23andMe test. Adding the health part adds to the cost. You can also transfer either or both of your results from Ancestry or 23andMe to Living DNA for free. You will get matching and a basic ethnicity estimate, The more detailed geographic breakdown has a cost associated with it. Thus, for $246 or less if you buy on sale, plus the shipping cost of the AncestryDNA and 23andMe kits, you can get in all 5 testing companies' databases, plus the third-party matching site, GEDmatch. I recommend using AncestryDNA's test over 23andMe for autosomal transfers, as their test tends to be more compatible with the tests at Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and with GEDmatch's matching algorithm. And just to be clear, AncestryDNA and 23andMe don't accept autosomal transfers, so direct testing at these companies is the only means of getting your DNA, or that of your relative, into their database. Just in time, if you are an Amazon Prime member, AncestryDNA kits are on sale for Amazon Prime Day for $49. That's $50 off, less than half the normal price. That is the lowest that I've ever seen it. The sale price is available through Wednesday, October 15th. Another question I get asked frequently is, how do I get family to test? I'm approaching 50 members of my close and extended family who have been DNA tested, so it's a valid question for people to ask of me. I do have some helpful hints that I've learned over the years. First and foremost, have patience with your potential tester. Don't overly pressure them, because that will shut them down. Your goal is to soften them to the idea of being tested, not hardening their resolve against it. This means being willing to explain the testing process, and debunking any misconceptions they may have about testing. This may require multiple conversations, as you may have to do research to counter some of their misconceptions. Also explain to them how their DNA specifically can help answer a particular question. A generalized, "it will help with my family history research," is too vague. Make it something concrete. Examples might be, as the last living person in your generation of the family, you have more of the DNA from family X than anyone else I can test. Or, we need another descendant of great-granny Sarah, who is not descended from my grandpa, to figure out who her parents were. Be prepared to offer to pay for the testing yourself. You may not wind up having to do so, but making the offer conveys to the potential tester that their DNA has value to you. I have had 2 testers who changed their mind from no to yes when I offered to pay, and both insisted on paying part of the cost themselves. Stimulate interest in genealogy and family history by discussing your own DNA results and others you've tested, and how those results have helped expand your knowledge of the family's history. Not just with potential test takers, but also with other family members the potential testers interact with. Sharing your findings with your family shows that progress is being made using DNA as a tool. You want to make sure that the family see testing in a positive light, that it is helping and is a worthy topic of discussion, even when you're not around to poke and prod the conversation. Make sure they get more than an ethnicity pie chart out of their results and interaction with you. This can be especially true of family you don't know to begin with. Beyond just their DNA results, share old family photos, stories, documents, show them mementos, etc. to build a collaborative relationship. One way I convinced my mother's second cousin to be tested, despite never having met him in person and only having spoken on the phone and corresponded through letters, was to send him printouts of old family photos from my great-grandmother's photo album, about 4 to a page, with lines on the page so he could fill in anything he knew about the photos, identifications, stories, etc. And I included a little checkbox that he could check if he wanted a copy of the photo. Also included in the packet mailed to him was a self-addressed stamped envelope to make returning the sheets to me easy. I purposely sent the packet so it would arrive before Thanksgiving. Over the holiday, he and several cousins apparently marveled over the photos my great-grandmother had in her album. A few weeks later, I got the packet back. One of our in-common cousins at his Thanksgiving gathering was flabbergasted that one of the photos was of him and his childhood dog, a beloved dog that he didn't even have a picture of. They had filled in what they knew of the photos. I now had people identified in most of the photos, people no one on my line knew. But about a dozen of the photos had the little checkbox marked. Within a couple of days, I had uploaded scans of the photos to a major national retailer's Photo Lab website and placed an order for the photos to be mailed to him. Yes, it cost me some money to do all that, but I got his DNA tested, and I got photo IDs I likely never would have gotten. But he and his family got cherished memories. Finally, be mindful of their comfort level. Know when to back off. Above all, be polite and respectful if they say no, because further development of the principles I listed above has more than once turned a no into a yes years later. I hope you now have a good sense of how to go about building a pool of DNA testers that will give you a good representation of your research target ancestor. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is your control group. Having a larger and broader pool of DNA-tested descendants of your research target increases your chances of finding relevant matches and understanding how they may relate to you. But your DNA experiment needs an experimental group. That's how the scientific method works, comparing your control and experimental groups. The experimental group are people descended from the research target's hypothesized parents, and people related through either or possibly both. It may not be necessary to find experimental testers yourself, though it can make it easier if you find people who are in the experimental group who should share larger amounts of DNA with members of your control group. If you aren't providing the experimental testers yourself, you must rely upon your testing company's database of DNA testers to provide you with the experimental group. And that's okay. Oftentimes the databases have a sufficient number of close matches to do this. Otherwise, you are left to wait for such matches to appear or to pursue candidates to test yourself. The best way to tell is to test your control group first, unless time is of the essence to test a potentially helpful experimental group member. Let's look at an example. Here we have a pool of 5 closely related DNA testers. Our research target is the great-great-grandmother of 4 of them, and the great-grandmother of the 5th. We are looking for her parents. If you already have a hypothesis couple, you need to investigate whether any of the known children of that couple have been DNA tested, and whether they are matches to the members of your control group. But if possible, you also want to independently verify genetic connections to each parent individually by finding DNA matches who relate solely through the mother's side and the father's side. However, merely having appropriate matches is not enough. The math has to work too. For each DNA match in your experimental group, you need to evaluate if the amount of shared DNA falls within the range expected for that relationship. Let's look at the target's DNA-tested great-grandchild and how he or she matches the 3 experimental group testers. One of them is presumably a 3rd cousin, and they share about 48 centimorgans of DNA. But the 2 testers who are presumably 4th cousins show significantly more shared DNA. According to the Shared Centimorgan Project, the range for a 3rd cousin is 0 to 234 centimorgans, with an average of 73 centimorgans. So this presumptive 3rd cousin is below average by about 1/3. The range for a 4th cousin is 0 to 139 centimorgans, with an average of about 35 centimorgans. At 108 centimorgans, one of them is 3 times the average, but is within the range. The other, however, is outside the range of a 4th cousin by over 40 centimorgans. This would be an anomaly that needs to be investigated, as it could mean the candidate couple are related to your testers, but not as the parent of your target. Indeed, it could mean that the target's father might be the candidate mother's brother, and that the candidate father's family has some other close connection to the family. Or there could be other reasons for the anomaly. What could cause such anomalies? Sometimes, when 2 lines of presumed half-cousins share more DNA than expected, it could be because they are more than half-cousins, but not quite full cousins. Yes, there is something in between. The ancestors on that half-cousin's line might not have been half-siblings, but rather 3/4 siblings. 3/4 siblings have one parent in common, with the other parents having been siblings to each other. These types of siblings will be in between, but overlap the range of full siblings and half-siblings. The cousin descendants will share slightly above average amounts of DNA with each other, above the normal for half first cousins and half second cousins. This was fairly common when a woman would die, especially in childbirth, leaving young children. The father would quickly remarry his late wife's sister to have someone to care for the children, with subsequent children to follow her. It was also not uncommon to see double first cousins. Double first cousins have the same 4 grandparents, rather than the normal 2. On average, this can nearly double the amount of shared DNA between double first cousins, and the effect will still be noticeable over the next several generations. This wasn't uncommon in rural areas where marriage partners were more limited. There is also pedigree collapse. If 2 cousins marry and have children together, their children will have pedigree collapse, the condition where the same person or couple appears in the family tree more than once. People with pedigree collapse will tend to more strongly match the family related through the person or couple appearing in their tree more than once, having essentially gotten a double shot of their DNA. But the effect fades in subsequent generations. You may be saying your ancestors wouldn't have married their own cousins, but eventually we all have pedigree collapse. Our number of ancestors doubles each generation back, while the population of Earth gets smaller as you go back in time. At some point, something's got to give. That said, it's only a concern for DNA analysis when it has occurred within the last 8 generations or so. As with double cousins, this wasn't uncommon in rural areas where marriage partners were more limited. And then there is endogamy. Endogamy is when persons share multiple ancestors in common, resulting in numerous paths for shared DNA to be passed down. And I don't mean 2 or 3 paths, it can sometimes be hundreds or thousands in extreme cases. Endogamy is frequent in some cultures, with a history of only marrying within their own caste, religion, ethnic group, or social group. It also occurs in small geographically isolated populations, such as islanders, mountain people, or even early colonial populations. Examples include Ashkenazi Jews, Mennonites, Amish, Polynesian and Pacific Islanders, early American colonists, Melungeons, and other isolated Appalachian settlers. And if there is no influx of new people into the population, and the intermarriage continues, endogamy and pedigree collapse will often conflate, such that both are present. If you don't see any anomalies, and all members of your control group match the known people in the experimental group within the proper range, and there are a reasonable number of such matches, you can begin to have confidence that your hypothesis is correct. AncestryDNA's through lines and MyHeritage's theory of family relativity present you with theories, hypotheses, based solely on and having a path to each other, but they do not currently evaluate the math. Just because they present you with a tree path to a DNA match does not mean that is the source of the DNA that makes you matches to each other. For example, I have a through lines match with whom I share 15 centimorgans of DNA, and it shows him connected as a 5th cousin once removed via my father's side of the family. But Ancestry itself labels him as being on my mother's side, and all of our shared matches I have identified are from my mother's side of the family. You need to evaluate the evidence yourself, and if you can't reach a sound conclusion, you keep working the connection as more matches come rolling in. Or you take the initiative to make your own match by getting additional persons tested. Sometimes your best matches are the ones you make yourself, so don't be shy about seeking out more cousins to test. Okay. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. We did have Alex chime in wanting to talk about privacy. The only surefire way to have privacy in DNA testing is not to be tested. Some of the companies, though, do make it a little bit easier that you can use a username. Why am I hear anything here? Put the headphones. There we go. Some of them allow you to choose your own username, so you don't have to use your real name. But oftentimes, if it's a close enough match, you can figure it out who the person is. I had, for example, a person at Ancestry.com that used the username Siamese Cat Lady. And I was able to figure out who she was based upon all the common matches that we had. And actually even messaged her, and she just laughed that I was able to figure out that this was my third cousin once removed, I think is what it was. Ancestry.com is probably the most private in terms of being able to figure it out, because you don't have what's called a chromosome browser, which lets you line up segments that you and your matches have in common. And so sometimes that obscures a little bit more who the person might be.
Well, after watching that, Craig, I'm glad we were recording it, because I would need to go back and see it at least one more time.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of this, I mean, it's dense material. I mean, trying to fit in this sort of information into a presentation less than an hour is often very difficult. So that is one good thing about it being recording, that you can go and watch it slower and be able to take notes and go back and review it. Because I mean, honestly, some of the stuff that I presented in this may be above the level of what a lot of people in just a regular user group are used to. Genealogists are a little bit more familiar. Like I use the term centimorgans. Centimorgans is a measure of how much DNA you and another match have in common. It's just basically the units that are used. It's like a distance measurement of miles in basically how long of segments you share.
So how do you figure out the relationship things? I know what a cousin is. I am not that sure what a second cousin is, and a fifth cousin once removed. I mean, I even took some anthropology classes, but you know, it's complicated.
Well, a first cousin, you have the same grandparents. That basically your parents are siblings to each other.
Yeah.
A second cousin is one more generation below that. So that means your grandparent and their grandparent are siblings. So there is a nice little table online. Yes, Janie?
I was gonna say, one way I can remember that first cousins, it's 1G, grandparent. If you're second cousins, it's
One way
2G.
that you can do it.
Yeah.
If you
So-
if you take the two people and count the number of G's, not great. You count, like if it's a great grandfather, that
3G.
means great grand. So that's a third cousin if you have that in
Right.
common.
And
Sometimes-
once removed, it's just a different generation from each other. Like your father and his first cousin, then your first cousin once removed, because you're not on the same generation with them. You have to be on the same
One
generation
generation
to be
down.
cousin.
Right. If you're looking at a chart, if you're parallel on the chart, you're a cousin. And if you're not quite parallel, you're a first or second removed.
Right.
So the children of your cousin would be
Removed.
a cousin once removed.
Right.
And it's what we growing up, you know, we didn't have any such thing as a first cousin once removed. It went from a first cousin to a second cousin.
Yeah,
Right.
that's how growing up, I always referred to my first cousins once removed to second cousins, but they were actually first cousins once removed.
I keep
Right.
thinking of that John Prine song with that complicated family where it ends up with the refrain, I am my own grandpa, because
Yeah.
people got married to different, you know, but it's crazy.
Well,
Is there such a thing as a half cousin?
Oh,
Is there
yes.
such a thing as a half cousin? And
Yes,
what's that
Yeah.
your half
relative to it?
sibling, your half sibling, your child and their child are half first cousins.
And you have
I
half.
had
Thank you.
And
I had a grandfather who died before I was even born. My older sister was born, but I was not born. and my grandmother remarried again.
Mhm. That was very common. And the cousins that you would have from that relationship are half cousins. And to Alex's point, remember how I mentioned 3/4 siblings. So you can have a 3/4 cousin, because if you have a 3/4 sibling, your child and their child are 3/4 first cousins rather than whole or half.
I'm not sure about the concept of the 3/4 cousin. What caused that?
Okay, so it was very common, especially out on the frontier, because there wasn't a lot of population to choose from for marriage. So a man and a woman get married and they have children. But suppose the woman, she dies in childbirth. So the man, he needs a wife to help care for the kids very quickly. And so what often happened is that he would sometimes marry his wife's sister. And then they would have more children together. And so the children that are produced from the second marriage are 3/4 siblings to the first wife's children, because they have the same father, but they are half cousins on the mother's side.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
And so that increases the amount of DNA. They're not first cousins. They share more than they would if they're first cousins, but they share less than full siblings. Yeah, it gets real complicated real quick. Being that my mother and father were both from very rural areas in my mother's family originally were from Middle Tennessee and my father's from Northern Arkansas. I have people that are my cousin 5 and 6 times over sometimes. And yeah, it gets real complicated.
I bet. So you have Arkansas roots then? Yes,
Stone County mostly.
Tommy was born in Ashdown, Arkansas.
Okay. Yeah, I think I remember that
Yeah.
you had mentioned that one time when we were discussing genealogy.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the difference between ancestor search and medical search. And, you know, with ancestor search, you want privacy because you don't necessarily want predatory relatives showing up on your doorstep. On the medical side, you don't necessarily want to have your DNA out there so that insurance companies will decide you might have a predisposition for something. This all sounds kind of like sometimes it's better not to know. Maybe just dig into the census records and see who used to live where, and can you track it by names?
Well, with DNA, we can actually now confirm that, because you never know when somebody was fooling around on somebody else. Janie and I can both testify that we have found plenty of instances where the records, they don't tell the whole story. They don't actually tell who the actual parents were because somebody was fooling around. For the medical stuff, 23andMe, of course, they have their test. If you get the ancestry version plus the medical version of it, they'll tell you your predisposition to certain diseases, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get them. I mean, having the predisposition to it does not mean that that's something that you're going to necessarily have. You may be more likely to have a heart attack, but that could also make you choose better life choices of how you eat, how you exercise, that sort of thing. So
but there are some hereditary there are some hereditary things though, like glaucoma is hereditary, albinism is hereditary, but it's like 1 or 2 generations down, and arthritis is hereditary, right?
Right. And so it can also help you provide the information to prepare for your eventuality if that's in your fate.
Are insurance companies actually going out and looking for this information?
They are not allowed technically under law. We have in this country, it's known as GINA, G-I-N-A, and it's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so for most purposes, they are not allowed to discriminate against you because of your genetic information. The exception to that is long-term care insurance.
What about law enforcement using DNA chains to identify suspects?
Now, that's been a big hot topic in genetic genealogy for about the last year and a half, 2 years, since the Golden State Killer case.
Right.
Some of the companies basically have locked down their databases. Law enforcement is not allowed to use them. AncestryDNA and 23andMe do not allow law enforcement to submit samples to be tested for genetic genealogy, forensic genetic genealogy. Family tree DNA allows it under certain circumstances, and you have to actually be opted in to being allowing your DNA to help identify unknown remains or be used to solve the murder. Now, keep in mind that generally in these cases, you are never ever contacted by law enforcement. They are simply using your connection pattern, as we showed in the slides, of how you might connect to this other person to figure out who their ancestors were, and therefore winnow it down to it has to be this person or this group of persons that was the person that perpetrated the crime. And so, I mean, they've had that happen where the genetic genealogists come back and say, okay, it has to be one of these 3 brothers. We actually had a case just actually last week where I think that happened. Basically, it was 3 brothers, and law enforcement then looked in their records for the original case and discovered that one of the 3 brothers was one of the persons that was an early person of interest in the case. Sure enough, they go and surreptitiously get his DNA from a discarded cup. It matches the crime scene, and he's arrested. So the genetic genealogy is never used as the matching for the arrest. They always get another sample from the person that is the suspect before they will make an arrest.
Sure, but you could be ratting out your cousin.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
and a lot of people in the genetic genealogy community say they have no problem with that. If my cousin committed murder, I want them behind bars.
Same.
Sure.
I mean, others are just much more concerned about their own personal privacy, which is perfectly valid. I'm of the opinion that your information should not be used for that purpose unless you gave consent, that it needs to be active consent on your part. And that's why one of the third-party testing sites known as GEDmatch, they actually made it to where you have to opt in for law enforcement matching. And I favored that decision by them to do that way.
Did you opt in?
I have opted in those of my family members who have given their consent for it. Some of them have, and some of them did not. And I actually even have a cousin of mine who does not want to be tested at all because he is afraid the government will have his DNA then if he gets tested. And it's like, okay, if the government really wants your DNA, they're going to find a way without you having to test at a DNA testing company for genealogical purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Moreover, it's like, okay, cousin, if you've committed a murder, your sister has tested, and about 14 of your first cousins have tested, so you're in trouble.
Busted.
Well, Craig, one thing I'd like to add, if you think you may find out something surprising about your family, don't get DNA tested.
Yes, that's another thing you would prepare your family members, that ask them, make sure that you ask them beforehand. If we find something that's not expected, do you want to know? And I thankfully started doing that with my own testers, and it came into play. I figure it's probably safe to say this, but one of them, his father was not who he had expected it to be. And thankfully, he did not want to know if there was anything wrong. And I didn't have to tell him that. But turned out that his father was somebody that he hated growing up, that it was basically his family's landlord. Messed around with his mom.
Oh. It happens.
It happens.
I'll second that about, well, it wasn't so disturbing, but I did find out things I thought were shocking when I have a few thousand people in my genealogical file, and when you get that big a file, you start learning things about your family.
Yes, I was on the high end. Before Ancestry, they just finished winnowing their database some that you no longer saw the really, really small matches. The cutoff used to be 6 centimorgans and they raised it to 8. So you have to share more DNA. Before they did that, I was matching about 0.9% of all people in the AncestryDNA database. Think about that. Almost 1 out of every 100 people who tested, and over 18 million people had tested.
Oh, wow.
But that's because, like I said, my southern ancestors were endogamous. So I have segments of DNA that have persisted longer than they ought to have. And so I match just a ton more people because of it. And they came from large families. You have to factor in that if you were the only child of an only child of an only child, you're not going to have as many matches. But my great-great-great-grandfather, who had 97 grandchildren, has much more likelihood that his descendants are going to test in numbers that they all match.
Craig.
Yes.
If anybody ever questions the thing about siblings, all you have to do is find a pair of fraternal twins. I've got pictures of my twin and I when we were a year old, and one of us has hair and teeth and the other one doesn't have either one. But we never, ever looked alike. She always looked like mother and I always looked like daddy. And it's like we were just siblings. That's all we were. We weren't the same.
Yeah, your siblings born on the same day.
Right.
Yes. Had the same birthday. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had the same experiences generally time-wise as far as what was going on in the family, except more stress because there was 2 of you they had to deal with.
Yeah.
More stress.
I've heard the stories.
You had the same
yes.
cohorts, same friends, sometimes, well, not necessarily the same friends, but the same age group that was the pool of friends. Because from my experience, fraternal twins often purposefully had different cliques.
Yep. Well, I didn't like her friends.
And she didn't like your friends.
No.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I have several tens of thousands of people in my database now from DNA testing, being able to match up with those cousins and basically prove our relationships. It's also given insight into the deeper ancestry from Y-DNA testing. I don't know, I think Craig probably already left, but one of the more interesting ones is one of my grandmother's direct male line we trace back to Yorkshire. And it was a very unusual type of Y-DNA that's just really not found in Northern England or in England in general. It's sub-Saharan Africa, well, not sub-Saharan, it's North African in origin. And it's like, how would a North African have gotten into Northern England? We did further testing to find out when the diversion occurred, and it went back to about 2,200 years ago. And you think about what was happening globally at that time, that was just before the Romans came in and conquered North Africa. And lo and behold, the legion that the Romans sent to Northern England to build Hadrian's Wall and to guard the northern frontier in England from the Picts came from North Africa. So my ancestor likely was a soldier or slave of the Roman army sent to northern England, to the area around York, and that DNA line persisted up there for 1,600 years before the descendants moved to America.
I was reading a book about Black Ancestry, and it was talking about that they found some bodies, or they found some bones in England that dated back to African ancestry. So that
Yes.
is definitely possible.
One of the people that, when they first started doing a lot of Y-DNA testing, the testing company Family Tree DNA, they discovered somebody in northern England, on the eastern coast of northern England. They didn't release the surname because it was a very unusual surname, but their DNA was so unique, but it was also so old that it was basically one of the first branchings from the common ancestor of all humans. And so they figured that, oh, this must be a Black person that migrated to England. It's like, no, they did the person's genealogy, and his family has been there for hundreds of years.
Wow.
And the person's white. I mean, you would not have guessed that he would have this African DNA type, but it just shows you the Y DNA, of course, stays with just the direct male line. But as you marry in to more white people, your skin color is going to become quote unquote white, but that Y DNA is still going to be that same. Y DNA does not pass, it does not change much when it's passed down. So it was able to trace back to this very early branching in the human history of the Y chromosome. See, I find this it's a very interesting mix of, my parents were both history teachers, so I've always had this fascination with history, and I'm much more of a science person, so genealogy with DNA just kind of seems to meld those two areas of interest together for me.
Mm-hmm.
And Janie did point out that I was off on my dates. I'm blaming it on Columbus Day of throwing me off because today feels like a Monday. But the Prime Day sale does end tomorrow. So if you're wanting to pick up an AncestryDNA kit for real cheap, the deadline is tomorrow.
Very well done.
Excellent, Craig. Do we have any other questions for Craig?
On a personal note, Craig, did you know John Marostica?
Yes. I've met John several times. I forgot that we had only did that in private. John Marostica, who has been a long time person in the Austin Genealogical Society and Williamson County Genealogical Society, passed away unexpectedly last week on Monday, was it, Janie?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, he and his wife had passed away only like 18 months ago unexpectedly as well.
Yeah,
it's kind of a big hit because he was a major player in their meetings. I think he ran a lot of the audio video stuff, as I recall from the meetings. He
had his
I think
website
took over
for it. Yeah.
Yeah, he took over for Williamson County Genealogical Society after Sarah moved away. So, I mean, he's going to be sorely missed in the Austin area for the Genealogical Society's research.
That's right. That's right.
Janie, I think you're on mute, and I see you talking.
I was on mute. I said he also did the Learning Center.
Oh yeah, the Lifetime Learning Series stuff. Yes.
And he had his own SIG that he did on a Saturday once a month at the Far West Library.
Right. Yep.
And he was teaching classes until COVID up here at the Amherst Library also on genealogy. So he was a big player in this community.
Yes, very much. And very friendly and personable guy. So he, like I said, he will be missed. It's a big loss for the genealogy community in Austin. Okay, wait, I'm seeing. Yes, Judy, I have done it before, but I try not to do it too often simply because of my time constraints. She asked if I ever hire myself out to do analysis for people, and it's because of the time constraints on me, I try to avoid it if at all possible. I'm perfectly willing to try to help for free but it has to be on kind of my time schedule, unfortunately.
My problem is that I do all the genealogy research for us, a large amount of it on my husband's tree, and he is the scientific mind and I am not, but he is not interested in doing the analysis.
Well, do we have anything else, or is it time to wrap up tonight's meeting?
Do you want to know about next month's program?
Yes. I did have it
Yes.
in the email, but please go ahead and explain what's going to be presented next month.
Okay. The new stuff that's available in iOS 14 is fascinating. And we wanted to bring some of it to the attention of all of our members. We've got 7 people participating in this, and each one of us have taken 1 or 2 elements of it, and we're going to go through that next month. Not necessarily getting into a lot of depth because we're covering a lot of areas. For instance, how to use the translator, the new one, how to use the new routes and guides and maps, what's just for OS iPad 14, what is there in HomeKit, and that's just part of them. So we're going to try to give you highlights of what all these things are, and enough information that if you personally want to get involved with whatever that element is, you're going to have enough to know where to start. And there will be a slideshow, a put together slideshow, and it'll get posted. So if, for instance, if you decide you want to know how to use the translator 3 weeks from now, you'll be able, 3 weeks from then, you'll be able to go and look it up. So it's very exciting topic, I think. And like I said, we had 7 people volunteer to help with this.
Tom had also mentioned that we kind of need, if anybody wants to make any nominations from the floor on the board, or that they can do it.
That's required by the bylaws. We have to do that tonight.
Yeah, so we've got the slate of officers from the committee, and then as Robert and Tom said, if anyone wants to nominate themselves or nominate someone else for any of the positions, they'll have the opportunity to do that.
No, they have to do it now.
Well, you can also write in on the ballot. We make that an option too.
Yeah, you can write in on the ballot, but that doesn't let everybody else know that you're interested in serving. So it's better to nominate tonight.
I nominate Nancy for vice president.
I'm sorry, what?
I nominate Nancy for vice president.
I
second.
I'm already on the slide.
She's already on the list. Oh, well.
Why don't you go over the list again?
Nancy, can you do that?
I'm sorry, what?
The request was, can you give the list of those who are on the slate of candidates again?
Oh, sure. For president, John Purvis. For vice president, Nancy Gravely. For treasurer, Tom Weaver. Secretary, Bill O'Barr. And for the 3 director positions, Koki Craig, Robert Frazier, Jim Wynn.
Thank you, Nancy.
Is there position available spoken for?
Say again?
Is every position spoken for?
Yes.
Yes. Are you interested in taking a position?
Not yet.
Okay.
I've done too many in the past.
I understand. As Tom said, though, tonight is the time for anyone that has a burning desire to be a member of the board to raise their hand and say, you know, I want to nominate myself, or I want to nominate someone else that's here on the meeting. Okay, but we will add, when we send out the email asking for ballots, we will add that there can be write-in ballots at that time. To follow up with what Nancy said earlier, just to make sure that we don't leave anyone out that might want to be included.
Okay.
If no one has anything else to add other than just talk, and we can do that all night, I think we ought to wrap things up and call it a wrap for the October meeting.
And I have one more comment. This is so typical. When we started the meeting, I couldn't make my video work. My 8-year-old grandson told me how to do it.
Yay!
He's already tier 2, isn't he?
Yeah.
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 Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, thank you,
Pleasure
Craig.
seeing
Good
everybody.
job, Craig.
You, Craig.
Thank you, Craig.
Great
Good seeing
presentation.
you.
Everybody.